Thank you, everyone. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. David Forman, a retired professor of cancer epidemiology with a distinguished career in cancer research. Dr. Forman has held key positions at prestigious institutions including CRUK, Oxford, and University of Leeds, and of course, International Agency for Research on Cancer, where he led the section of cancer information. He also served as Director of Information Research for the UK National Cancer Intelligence Network. Dr. Forman's expertise spans global cancer trends, but he is particularly renowned for his pioneering work in gastric cancer epidemiology. His contributions to the early studies on the association between gastric cancer and H. pylori infection have been instrumental in shaping our understanding of the disease. We are very honored to have him here with us today to share his insights into the topic. And David, the floor is yours, and thank you so much once again for agreeing to give us the keynote lecture. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that introduction. I'd like to thank the director, Elisabetta, who I know had to leave for another meeting, and Parta for inviting me to the agency, which has formed an institutional background to an important part of my career. It's a great honor to be at IARC again. I'd like to thank Jin and the core working group members for inviting me to give this keynote lecture to kick off the meeting today. I must admit, when Jin first invited me, I said, "What? You must be joking. It's 10 years since I formally retired." And she said, no, we definitely want you to speak and give this lecture. And I then said, but it's 7 years since I've given a presentation. And I think I've lost all those sorts of skills. And she said, no, nonsense, it's going to be like riding a bike and you'll never forget. And well, we'll see. My final gambit was that, look, I've forgotten how to use PowerPoint. It's all gone. I'm getting old. And her counter to that was to say, we'll support you in that. And actually, I'd like to thank Kritika for helping me put together the slides. The content is my responsibility, but the beauty of the slides is down to Kritika's input. Thank you for that. I've decided to call this presentation about whether we can use or make leverage of our knowledge of Helicobacter and its role in gastric carcinogenesis as a cause for optimism, in that we perhaps have at our fingertips a means of mass prevention of gastric cancer. But as yet, we have no happy ending to this particular story. And what we have here perhaps sort of symbolizes that challenge, in that we have the Globocan map of the number or the rates of cancer, gastric cancer worldwide, attributable to Helicobacter. Essentially, the darker green the geographic area, the higher the rate of cancer attributable to H. pylori. A map which I was involved in producing an earlier version of many years ago. And set against that, perhaps to some of us who've worked in H. pylori for some time, the sort of inner beauty of these bacteria, and if you like, the contrast between a really interesting, fascinating organism for some of us, and the lethal danger, lethal mortality that it poses. So what I want to do this morning is give some personal opinions and perspectives on this whole problem. I want to provide a historical context, talk about the current state of the art, at least as I see it, and then towards the end, perhaps in more discursive mode, talk about some of the public health challenges that are confronting those who seek to make interventions in this area. As part of the historical context, I want to embark on two diversions, I've called them, regarding peptic ulcer disease, which actually doesn't get discussed now very much, which the epidemiologists in the audience, I think, will hopefully find as fascinating as I did when I came across them. Diversions I partly knew about, but this talk gave me the opportunity to go into them in a little bit more depth. But anyway, 2024 marked the 40th anniversary of the identification of H. pylori in the stomach by Warren and Marshall in Australia. And last year there were a number of papers, and the authors of some of them are in the audience, celebrating in a way the discovery and providing a commentary on what's happened in the intermediate 40 years, apologies. In fact, it was the 41st anniversary last year, and it was 1983 that the very first papers from Warren and Marshall were published as two separate letters, quite an interesting way of doing it, in the Lancet. Warren, a very unassuming pathologist, described the organism and its habitat, and Barry Marshall, not unassuming at all, outlined the history of looking for bacterial organisms in the stomach and provided some of the clinical context. The pictures at the bottom are taken from those Lancet papers. Actually, the first one on the far left is actually a picture of Barry Marshall's own stomach when he did this now quite celebrated self-experiment and gave himself a dose of Helicobacter to look at the immediate acute effects on his own gastric epithelium. And if anyone's interested in the history of the identification of Helicobacter, Barry put together that book, Helicobacter Pioneers. I'm not sure if it's still available, it must be somehow, which actually celebrated the 20th anniversary of the discovery, in which he goes into some detail into the nature of the discovery, but more importantly, from a historical scientific context, he gives due note and due weight, and other authors in that volume talk about the many previous identifications of gastric bacteria. And it was not the first time that bacteria had been identified in the stomach, although still by 1983, the general consensus was that the stomach was a sterile organ and bacteria didn't survive. And the last paragraph of Marshall's letter to the Lancet, 1983, I'll remind you. In fact, the last sentence of the last paragraph states, in talking about bacteria, if they're truly associated with the formation of gastritis in the stomach and the initial inflammatory response to these bacteria, he says with perhaps some considerable foresight, they may have a part to play in other poorly understood gastritis-associated diseases, such as peptic ulcer and gastric cancer. So at the time, that was quite a remarkable and astonishing claim. And I think it's fair to say it was totally disbelieved by the entire gastroenterological community. And yet, this bacteria, which in 1983 didn't even have a name, they didn't know what to call it. They first of all called it Campylobacter jejuni because they thought it was related to other, Campylobacter pylori because they thought it was related to other Campylobacter species. Seemed to be perhaps associated with gastritis, but no clear pathology. 22 years later, they were awarded, as you all know, the Nobel Prize. The comment from the Nobel Prize committee in making the award was that thanks to their pioneering discovery, peptic ulcer disease, which was a horrible disease, and associated with a really horrible morbidity and quite a lot of mortality, but it was no longer a chronic, frequently disabling condition, but a disease that can be cured by a short regimen of antibiotics and acid secretion inhibitors. So note the reference to peptic ulcer disease. There was no reference to gastric cancer in the Nobel citation in 2005. So I said I wanted to take a couple of diversions regarding peptic ulcer, and they relate to these wonderful people who you see in this slide. And do any of you know the couple that are on the left-hand side, who they are? No takers? So they are, actually I've had the opportunity to meet all three of these individuals at a very early stage in my career. And I didn't, many years later, I now recognize their importance, which I'm going to explain to you. And I didn't know it at the time, and I so sorely wish that I did. So the couple on the left are two fabulous South African epidemiologists, Mervyn Susser and Zena Stein, a married couple, who spent most of their career at Columbia University in New York, working large, well, most celebrated work was on HIV and AIDS epidemiology, but they were involved in many other studies. Anyhow, in the 1950s, they were refugees from apartheid South Africa. They were personal friends of Nelson Mandela, and they came to escape the regime because they knew they'd be arrested. And they first of all came to the UK, and they worked initially in Manchester, and they were encouraged to do some descriptive epidemiology, looking at peptic ulcer mortality. And they did a phenomenal amount of work in that area and produced this Lancet paper in 1962. So this is now, that date is correct. That was now, what, some 20 years before Warren and Marshall, called Civilization and Peptic Ulcer. What a title, eh? That paper was actually reprinted in 2002 in the International Journal of Epidemiology, with several fascinating commentaries. And again, if you're interested in history and development of ideas, it's well worth looking at that particular set of papers around this paper. And what they did is something which is very boring to the outside world, but absolutely core business for descriptive epidemiology, they looked at the patterns of mortality, and they looked at it in various ways. And in the end, they decided they had to look using age period cohort modeling. And what gave them their insights were when they looked at peptic ulcer deaths by year of birth of particular cohorts. And I won't go into the details of the birth cohort analysis that they undertook, but they said in their 62 paper that their data pointed to a widespread causal exposure occurring early in childhood that confirmed a lifelong progressive risk of ulcer disease. Fascinating insights, all obtained from descriptive epi data. And they offered no convincing mechanism to account for this effect. There were various theories thrown around about the role of pollution, the role of stress. But it wasn't, in fact, until Marshall and Warren made the discovery of Helicobacter, and we understood that it was largely acquired in childhood and produces a lifelong infection, that confers an increasing risk of ulcer disease with age. And fascinating piece of very, some would regard as humdrum research, leading to such an important insight many, many years before we understood the mechanism that produced the data that they were describing. Now, I said there were two diversions, and the second relates to this gentleman on the right-hand side. Anyone know who he is? No? Anyone else? Paul, any ideas? British gastroenterologist.
Avery Jones.
It is indeed, well done. This is Sir Francis Avery Jones, a pioneer gastroenterologist in the UK, set up one of the first departments of gastroenterology at the Central Middlesex Hospital, which remained for many decades a pioneering centre for work on peptic ulcer. And he became one of the UK's leading peptic ulcer specialists, and did a fantastic amount to try and alleviate the suffering that his his wards were largely totally full of peptic ulcer patients. There were no clear remedies for the disease. A lot of the patients were in considerable pain. They had to find ways of alleviating the suffering. There were often heroic surgical attempts to get rid of the ulcer, and patients were then hospitalized for many weeks after the intervention. Avery Jones was regarded as one of the, if you like, centers of his group at the Central Middlesex was regarded as one of the centres of excellence. It was by no means a sort of core UK teaching hospital. It was a little bit of an outpost. And people tried to get referred to him because they knew he was such a thoughtful and caring physician. Now, he was also interested in the epidemiology of peptic ulcer, and wanted to undertake some studies looking at the effects of occupation and smoking on the development of the disease. He also wanted to undertake some clinical studies of diets for ulcer patients, what was the most appropriate and most tolerable diet. And in 1946, so note the date. Again, this one is correct. He was looking for a research assistant to help him in this epidemiological and clinical trial work, and he required a research assistant. And the man he appointed to undertake his research on peptic ulcer studies. In 1946, there were a lot of medical orderlies returning from service in the forces after the war. Was this gentleman here? He's in the middle of the bottom row of the first picture, and slightly younger, but better profile view in the second picture. And anyone know who that is? No? So you'll probably have a much better idea when I show you the same person in later life. And that was Sir Richard Dole. So Richard Dole's very first research undertaking was working as a research assistant to Francis Avery Jones. And together, over the next 6 years, they worked on this incredible report, which you can download from the internet, on occupational factors in the etiology of gastric and duodenal ulcers. It's a 100-page report, absolutely fascinating to read, written with the beautiful language that we later came to associate with Richard Dole. Very accurate summaries, very concise opinions expressed, and the evidence for and against very carefully weighed up. And it's worth noting, amongst other things, that they carried out 6,000 assessments of men and women employed in a whole variety of carefully selected occupations. And then Dole himself conducted 1,300 interviews, 1,300 by one person, to assess the status of these employees, whether they had indigestion or not, and then went on to draw conclusions regarding the incidence of ulcer disease. Some of them then went on to have further medical investigations, but looking in a wide variety of occupations. A wonderful read. There was a 1.6% failure rate of, so they knew they had to interview about 1,310 people, or 1,320. They lost to interview 1.6% of that group, which is a phenomenal participation rate, if you think about it. It's also worth noting the coordinator, I don't know if I can, yes I can, the coordinating committee of this group, Avery Jones there, Dole there, Charles Fletcher, very important physician, a respiratory physician who went on to persuade Bradford Hill, who you'll note down there, to conduct some studies into the causes of the growing epidemic of lung cancer. At that time, Bradford Hill was chair of medical statistics at the London School of Hygiene. And while doing this research, Dole met Bradford Hill, obviously, and decided he needed to know some statistics in order to conduct his own research. So he went to undertake a course under Bradford Hill at the School of Hygiene. They then decided that, partly due to Charles Fletcher's influence, that they should look at smoking and lung cancer. And you'll know that the rest is celebrated epidemiological history. The other fascinating fact for me of this coordinating committee is that the last name there is Joan Faulkner. It was she who was working at the MRC at the time who persuaded Avery Jones to take on Doll as a research assistant. She later married Sir Richard Doll, and they had a wonderful partnership for the next 50 years. So those are my two diversions. I found them of immense interest, and I hope you enjoyed these stories. But if you're interested in the sort of historical background, there's so much material that can now be gained very readily, and thanks to the International Journal of Epi for resurrecting the Stein and Susser story. And this, as I say, this monograph, which is readily available, is a fascinating read. Anyway, that's my personal peccadillo. Let's go on to gastric cancer. And there are a number of key epidemiological features of gastric cancer that need to be perhaps emphasized at this point. In terms of global trends, everyone knows that gastric cancer is declining in incidence, and one of the key features of the disease is that for much of the 20th and 21st century, most populations would show a decreasing incidence over time, a core epidemiological fact. The other counterpoint to that is that even despite that decrease, if you project into the future, there is going to be, according to estimates from this agency and others, a considerable growing burden of the disease as a result of the aging of the population and the growth in that elderly population. And for those of you staying for the workshop, my former colleague Isabel Sergio-Mataram will be going into details of that and other aspects of the descriptive epidemiology. So on the one hand, you have declining incidence, good news. On the other hand, you have a growing burden, not such good news. Second feature is that gastric cancer is invariably associated with low social economic status, and this was re-brought to my attention from this recent Dutch paper, which I know Iris is a contributing author of, and looking at the incidence of gastric cancer on the left-hand side by socioeconomic status, and showing an increased incidence in the more deprived sections of the population. It's been shown many other times, but it was a particularly nice demonstration from colleagues in the Netherlands. And also they did this interesting analysis looking at country of birth of immigrants to the Netherlands, and again showing that those who came from relatively more affluent areas of the world did not show an increased or an excess of gastric cancer compared to the Dutch population, but the inverse was true. So coming from deprived areas or relatively deprived areas was associated with an increased risk of gastric cancer. And the other thing that I think is now established and regarding the epidemiology of gastric cancer and is well known to this audience is that the most significant and the most important risk factor for gastric cancer is likely to be Helicobacter pylori. In fact, it's more important Helicobacter is more important to gastric cancer than HPV is numerically to the cancers that it's associated with, or the hepatitis virus, or other infectious agents. So if you take a snapshot of all the carcinogenic infectious agents, this data again from the agency here shows that H. pylori is the most substantive in terms of numbers. And looking at the etiology of gastric cancer, we have to pay tribute, first of all, to Pelayo Correa, who was actually my predecessor in a way, in that he gave the keynote presentation at this equivalent meeting in 2013, 2014, and presented or represented his well-known model on the progression of gastric cancer, which was first articulated way back in '75, again before Marshall and Warren, and Correa and his collaborators first of all talked about the pathological sequence of events leading to gastric cancer in the stomach, kicked off by the initial development of non-atrophic and then atrophic gastritis, leading then to transformational change with the metaplasias, dysplasia, and cancer. And way back from '75, environmental dietary factors were seen as the major drivers involved in this progression. Excuse me. And initially in the '70s and early '80s, there was a lot of attention paid to salt in the diet, to fruits and vegetables in the diet, as causing the initial event to set off this cascade and the development of inflammation, gastritis and inflammation. And then downstream of that, there was a lot of work undertaken on the role of nitrates in drinking water and in the diet, and its balance with vitamin C as producing carcinogenic or anti-carcinogenic events. And there was an enormous weight of research in this area. This agency sponsored 4 or 5 enormous global meetings on the role of nitrosamines in cancer. And I myself was brought into thinking about gastric cancer through working on nitrates in water supplies in particular. And I was actually persuaded to do that by Richard Doll, who I then had the good fortune to be working for at the time. And of course, there is still relevance to that whole etiological cascade, and there is still some work going on in it. But the flip, the transformation, if you like, was brought about by knowledge of H. pylori and its role in the development of gastritis. And very quickly in the '80s, it was then recognized that actually Helicobacter plays a key role, the key role, in that initial event setting off the Correa cascade. A vast amount of research was rapidly undertaken, and this I realize now where my confusion about the Nobel Prize arose. But one of the significant staging posts in bringing together that evidence was in 1994, when this agency undertook an evaluation of Helicobacter pylori and identified it as so-called group 1 carcinogen, an established cause of human cancer. This photograph of that monograph meeting, I think, Francis, you supplied that, so thank you for that. You might notice Francis himself on the left-hand side. His beard's a little different in color. My hair, however, is exactly the same color. So even then I had grey hair. There's some fantastic historiography in this photograph. The guy next to me is Henrik Moller, my good Danish friend who was actually the responsible officer from the IARC monographs program for this meeting. I could go through it one by one. Paleo Carreras himself is in the front row. This guy here is interesting. That is Ernst Kuipers, then a junior researcher, later to become the director or chief executive of the Erasmus Institute in the Netherlands. He then became, during COVID times, the Dutch Minister of Health, amazingly. But at this time, he was unknown to the world, and he always, in conversations afterwards, attributes this attendance at this meeting as a significant point in his career. And this was really quite a significant moment for H. pylori in establishing its role in human cancer. Sorry, I've gone the wrong direction. And the evaluation as a group 1 carcinogen was largely based on a combination of coming out of the gastropathology work of Correa and others, a mechanistic understanding of gastritis, in combination with several epidemiological studies, some prospective cohort studies, geographic correlation studies, some of which I was involved with. Julie Parsonet, who was going, well, I think she is at this meeting, attending remotely at the moment, as she's a little bit poorly, undertook another. And it was a combination of the epidemiology and the mechanistic basis that led to its group 1 classification. It was a little of a controversial decision at the time. It was not, has to be said, unanimous opinion amongst the working group members, but nevertheless the vast majority evaluated it in that way. In 2009 it was re-evaluated, and by that time it was beyond doubt. There was a large number of studies then undertaken, much more better understanding of how to evaluate HP infection in serological samples, association with other forms of cancer, although not with esophageal cancer. There was a robust animal model in the Mongolian gerbil, more evidence on the mechanistic basis. But at the time, the trials, the randomized trials of eradication as a means of preventing gastric cancer, the theme of this workshop, at the time had insufficient power to weigh heavily in the evidence consideration. However, by 2014, the precursor to this meeting today, the RCTs have begun to show H. pylori treatment as being effective. There was very good cost-effectiveness work. There were uncertainties regarding the generalizability of the results from the trials, but it was recommended by the agency in this working group report that countries explore the possibility of introducing population-based screening and treatment, but those programs should be undertaken in conjunction with a valid assessment of the program processes, and as you read there, feasibility, effectiveness, and adverse consequences. And that perhaps is one of the 40th anniversary papers, again, Peter's in the audience, came to a conclusion which I would agree, that although considerable progress has been made, there remains a final mile to traverse in the prevention of these diseases. An opinion, a conclusion that I would certainly endorse, and very much the workshop that's taking place here is about that final mile, how we proceed along it. Just a quick sort of recapitulation of the model that we're working to here is that one is attempting to identify an at-risk population, at risk of gastric cancer. One is attempting to screen that population for H. pylori by non-invasive means, usually serology or a breath test, treat those infected, and that now still depends on either a combination of antibiotics and acid suppression, and then monitor the impact on outcomes and disease. And the current status of the randomized controlled trials, this is actually new data. It's not quite been, or it's in press with gastroenterology and is available from Paul Moyadi and Alex Ford and Jin and myself, updates the current RCT situation and is showing a number of studies which met the inclusion criteria, all such studies lying on the negative side of the no effect line in this forest plot, and overall a risk ratio of 0.64, quite sort of robustly, if you like, on the no effect underneath the no effect line, indicating prevention of gastric cancer in association with the intervention, which was the eradication of H. pylori. Now, the last study here from Pan et al. Dwarfs all the other studies in terms of magnitude of participants, and it is the most recently published such study. You can see there, well, 25,000 patients, subjects in each arm. It's worth looking at in a little bit more detail, partly because it is so new and so weighs heavily in considerations. So 180,000 participants overall in Linkou County in China. I know that one of the authors of the Pan et al. Paper is with us today. And 25 to 54, all of them were tested for H. pylori. There were 50%, 7% positives, and they were randomized, they were cluster randomized. So the village, 980 villages involved, and they're cluster randomized. So the village itself was either an intervention or a control arm, and the randomization was between symptom alleviation, essentially sort of acid suppression, or anti-pylori treatment together with symptom alleviation. A very impressive figure of 91% were completed treatment. They followed up all these subjects to retest them after the intervention and noted actually quite a high failure rate, 27% failed eradication after, well, at the time, and then there was subsequent 11 years of follow-up. And the plot on the left-hand side shows the, so the green line at the bottom are those who are never H. pylori positive. They were H. pylori negative from the beginning. They had the lowest subsequent risk of gastric cancer. The blue purple line in the middle is the intervention arm, and the red line at the top is the symptom alleviation arm. So the difference between the two, the intervention and the control arm, is not huge. It just about havers on statistical significance if you are interested in that. But there is an effect, albeit a somewhat modest one. And there's been lots of discussion and explanations put forward as to why the risk is relatively low. But this, of course, is such a giant trial, it's really important to fully understand it. Stuck. See what's happened. And something that persuaded me about the trial is, this is a secondary analysis, but looking at the intervention arm receiving H. pylori treatment, if they are divided into those who failed treatment and those in which treatment was successful, the effect is only seen in the participants where the intervention was successful. Now, that's not the primary randomization. That's between intervention and at all, whether or not it's successful or failed. So this is a post hoc analysis, but nevertheless, I think should carry some weight. There are a number of ongoing trials and studies. Apologies if I've missed anything off. I know there's all sorts of work going on around the world. When I finally reviewed this slide, I realized, God, I haven't mentioned this, I haven't mentioned that. So apologies if your trial, your study is not mentioned here. But the ones that I know about, so I'll take personal responsibility, there's the HELPER study, which Jin Park's heavily involved with in Korea. There's a screening study, which I'm partially involved with, led by Nick Wald in the UK. And there's Marcis's study in Latvia, GISTAR. And then a number of European initiatives are putting forward the ideas for trials and interventions for further studies in Europe, including, as sponsored by EUROHELICAN, a trial in young subjects in Slovenia, and various other initiatives in Europe. I want to focus on EUROHELICAN because they are the sponsors of today's meeting, or that initiative, that grant is responsible for bringing this working group together for this meeting here today. And I want to, as a sort of final bit of data, just give some focus on this study from Matsu Islands in the Asian islands between Taiwan and mainland China. And they embarked, the investigators here, and Dr. Lee is in the audience, very heavily involved with this work. They conducted a true population-based intervention against H. pylori. It was launched in 2004. The entire population of the island over the age of 30 was invited to test and treat. They had a very high incidence of gastric cancer, and they managed to reach 85% of the population. And the left-hand graph shows the incidence of H. pylori prior to the intervention, well, at the start of the intervention, and then coming down dramatically post-intervention. And then the impact of that intervention, bear in mind the numbers here are very small, the impact of that intervention on gastric cancer rates, spiky but sharp, and relatively little gastric cancer occurring post-intervention, which kind of seems a little too good to get an immediate signal after the intervention. But nevertheless, I'm sure the investigators are carrying on looking at the impact of their mass eradication. But they have gone on to look at other endpoints very important to the evaluation of programs. And in particular, they reported no significant impact on antimicrobial resistance. And I just want to focus on that as really the last point before I start my conclusions. This again is data from Dr. Lee, looking at resistance levels to the chief antibiotics used in the treatment of H. pylori from a 2024 paper, looking first of all at primary, secondary and tertiary resistance. And you can see if you fail the first line of treatment, the resistance levels to second and third line potential drugs is very high. And then on the bottom, you look at resistance levels year by year following the intervention in this study, and they are noticeably, I think, increasing in the population as one sort of succeeds through 2014 up until 2020. So that is a concern, and it's a concern that is perhaps mapped by the incredible space that is given to the problems being posed by antibiotic resistance. This is from this IARC's parent body, the World Health Organization, and one of IARC's main partners, the Union for International Cancer Control, really emphasizing the worries that are being projected about antimicrobial resistance globally as a real problem that needs to be overcome, and it is a key priority for the World Health Organization. So in bringing things to a conclusion, I'm going to start by sort of thinking about why we don't have a happy ending to this story. There are some real public health challenges in implementing a screen and treat model for gastric cancer prevention. And in public health terms, making the case that antimicrobial resistance will only be minimally impacted will be an enormous challenge for the advocates of H. pylori screen and treat. And it will require both scientific and also, I think, political debate and intervention. And then you have to face the problem of whether multi-drug antibiotic treatment is truly simple enough for large-scale use in populations, not in the clinic, but in the populations where you might not necessarily have the means to look at compliance and look at follow-up in the way that the investigators did in the Lingq study in China. And then you have to consider in making interventions whether treatment success, I mean H. pylori treatment success, should be measured after the intervention. And if it is, what do you then do with treatment failures? Do you go back with second or third line therapies and run the risk of hitting the elevated problems of antimicrobial resistance? You have to consider treatment failures. What is the psychological impact of knowing that you've been invited into a program to reduce your risk of gastric cancer, and then learning that in fact you have not been successful in eradicating the bacteria? What is the psychological impact of that knowledge? You also have to think about whether enough cancers are really getting prevented by the intervention. As you saw from some of the trials, and particularly the Chinese study, even in the intervention arms of those studies, a lot of people go on to get gastric cancer. In other words, the effects of the intervention is limited to a subset of subjects for whom the intervention is taking place. And generally, partly due to the work of this agency, it has to be said, gastric cancer is seen as a declining problem because the incidence plots show it as disappearing. And Julie, who may be listening somewhere, in a, I think, very wise editorial a few years ago, said the prospect of treating a huge proportion of the population with multiple, relatively broad spectrum antibiotics when only a small percentage will go on to get cancer and an even smaller percentage will have it successfully prevented, I might add, is both, and her words were, logistically daunting and microbiologically worrisome. I think we're hoping that Julie will be here later in the week, and we can bring her into the discussion of this point. But the optimistic, Jin said, please, please, please end on an optimistic note. And the optimistic counterpoint to what I've just been saying is that there's likely to be a substantial burden of gastric cancer in the future, despite its declining incidence. The high-risk communities, or the highest risk communities, are often those associated with low socioeconomic status and and high levels of deprivation. So if one is serious in making an impact on cancer in deprived populations, then this needs to be on the agenda. I think it's beyond doubt that H. pylori is the primary cause of gastric cancer, and all that early epidemiology has helped establish that. The ability to test easily and non-invasively for H. pylori is there. There are affordable and effective treatment regimens in terms of antibiotics, despite the provisos that I've outlined. And the existing RCTs and other population-based interventions have provided proof of concept. So H. pylori eradication could be an actionable and cost-effective intervention to prevent gastric cancer. I would leave it at that point. I just want to sort of raise a few flags for potential discussion. Why has this never really become a serious public health concern? We never hear mention of gastric cancer in perhaps the way that we do of other cancers for which there are population-based interventions being promoted. I've not yet mentioned the word vaccines, but I think one of the biggest failures of H. pylori scientific endeavour since that discovery in 1983 is that an effective vaccine has not been developed, and I'm glad that we have a vaccinologist amongst us for this week. So to answer, well, not really answer, but to pose the question that was raised by Peter in that 40-year celebratory paper last year, can we really traverse the final mile? Thank you for your attention.